It's strange how you can be so blind to the cracks forming right under your nose until they're too big to ignore. I honestly thought Emma and I were on solid ground, or at the very least that if things ever got shaky we could work through it. We'd had our ups and downs like any couple, but recently things felt off, like a fracture spreading quietly until it's too late to fix. Looking back now, it amazes me how much I ignored, convinced myself it was just her going through a rough patch, maybe some stress from work. But it was so much more than that, a hell of a lot more. At first, the signs were subtle, or maybe I just didn't want to see them. One night, after she'd come home late yet again, it hit me that she hardly even looked at me anymore, barely muttering anything more than short replies, as if she'd rather be somewhere else. Even sitting in the same room, it was like she was miles away. She'd just sit there, glued to her phone, or lost in some thought I couldn't reach. And every time I tried to close that gap, it was like trying to squeeze blood from a stone. It was bizarre, especially for us. We used to talk about everything, from our weekend plans to what we'd name our future kids. Suddenly, all that was off limits. If I asked her anything, she'd just wave me off, mumbling something about being exhausted or swamped with work. The first time I genuinely thought, something's really wrong here, was one morning over breakfast. We were both nursing cups of coffee, the sunlight just starting to brighten up the room, and she was buried in her phone. Then, out of nowhere, she smiled. A private, secret smile at whatever was on her screen. It wasn't just any smile, though. I felt it in my gut. Something in that moment felt like a betrayal. I tried to play it off, half joking, "Who's got you smiling like that?" She froze for a split second, then brushed it off with a quick, "Oh, it's nothing," and changed the subject before I could even react. I remember a sick feeling welling up inside me, some instinctual reaction I couldn't shake. But I pushed it down, telling myself, she's just stressed. You're reading too much into it. Yet that feeling didn't go away. After that, things only got stranger. Suddenly, she was dressing differently, buying new clothes and accessories that weren't exactly in our usual price range. When I asked about it, she'd just say it was important to fit in at work or look the part. It rubbed me the wrong way, though. This was Emma, the girl who used to laugh at high-end brands. Now she looked like she'd stepped off some high-fashion runway. She'd always been so down to earth, and suddenly, I didn't recognize the woman in front of me. And then came the parties. I'd always been the one to pull her along to social events, but now she was the one attending these supposed work gatherings, where, for some reason, I wasn't invited. She'd say they were purely professional, wouldn't even let me drop her off. One night, I got this idea to surprise her. I thought maybe I could swing by, catch her off guard, give her a laugh. I pictured her looking up, seeing me, smiling like she used to, introducing me to her coworkers. But man, it didn't go like that at all. When I walked in, there she was, sitting close to her boss, Ethan. I'd heard her mention him a few times, but seeing them there, laughing and leaning toward each other, it felt like someone had knocked the wind out of me. She looked at him like he was the most fascinating man in the world. And then, she spotted me. Her face drained of color, and she mumbled something, panicked. Before I could even get a word out, she was coming up with some excuse, practically dragging me out of there. I told myself maybe it was nothing, but that sick feeling in my gut wouldn't let it go. I didn't know who to talk to about it. Going to family felt humiliating. So I reached out to Daniel, an old friend who'd known us both for years. I laid it all out. Emma's distance, her phone obsession, the new clothes, the party with Ethan. He listened quietly, didn't laugh it off or tell me I was being paranoid. Instead, he suggested I try talking to her, maybe even consider couples therapy. Deep down, I knew he was right. We needed to address it if there was any hope left. But when I brought it up to Emma, she shut me down so fast it made my head spin. "Therapy?" she scoffed. "What do we need therapy for?" She dismissed my worries, said I was overreacting, that I was making a mountain out of a molehill. The way she looked at me in that moment, like I was beneath her, it hurt more than I want to admit. That's when I realized this wasn't just a rough patch. This was something else, something serious. In the following weeks, I started noticing things I'd been blind to before, or maybe things I just didn't want to see. She'd come home late, Then even later, until there were nights when she didn't come home at all. She'd say it was a business trip, but there were too many loose ends, too many little lies I caught. She'd avoid my calls, barely respond to texts. And physical affection? That was gone. She'd brush me off with a quick, "I'm too tired," or "maybe tomorrow," like I was just an annoying chore she wanted to avoid. I couldn't keep sitting around, letting it gnaw at me. I needed answers. So, I did something I never thought I'd do. I started snooping. I checked her social media, looked through her call logs, even took a peek at her credit card statements. At first, there was nothing big, just small, unsettling details. Hotel bills from places nearby, restaurant charges for places she'd never mentioned. Each one felt like a tiny dagger. She used to be my partner, my best friend, and now it felt like I was living with a stranger. And the worst part? I couldn't bring myself to confront her. I wasn't ready to hear whatever lie or excuse she'd come up with because, deep down, I knew it wouldn't change what was already broken. You ever get that feeling where your heart's pounding so loud you can almost hear it echoing in your ears? That was me, standing there, staring at her work laptop sitting on our kitchen counter. She'd rushed out to another work event with her boss and had left it behind, too preoccupied, probably, to remember. I'd spent hours wondering where she was, picturing her with him, trying to block out images of whatever they were doing together. The laptop, it felt like it held the answers, a way to end all this agonizing uncertainty once and for all. I stood there, staring at it, knowing that opening it would mean crossing a line I'd never crossed before. I told myself it would be a breach of her privacy. But who was I kidding? Privacy? That was shattered the minute she decided to start sneaking around. I was just so damn tired of being in the dark. My hand shook as I stared down at the laptop, my finger hovering over the lid, almost like I was hoping my hesitation might magically erase all my doubts. But finally, I cracked it open, my heart thudding so hard I could feel it in my chest. She hadn't even bothered to log out. Her inbox was right there, practically daring me to look. I told myself, if there's nothing in here, I'll shut it down and never mention this again. But deep down, a part of me already knew what was waiting. I wish I could say I found nothing, just a bunch of boring work emails, maybe a harmless message or two. But right at the top was a message from her boss, Ethan. Seeing his name alone was like a punch straight to the gut, but I clicked, and there it was, as clear as day. Message after message filled with flirtation, leaving no room for doubt. Phrases like, "Can't wait for tonight's meeting," and "You looked incredible last night." They talked about promotion meetings, but the only thing they were promoting was their twisted little affair. My vision blurred, and I had to blink just to keep reading. I felt sick, like I'd swallowed something poisonous. And then, as if that wasn't enough, there was a message about me. About me. She described me as underdeveloped and unambitious. Not the kind of partner she needed in her life, apparently. The worst part? I'd been there, every step of the way, supporting her through each decision, every career move, even the tough ones. She used to thank me for being her rock. Now, in her eyes, I was just a stepping stone, something to leave behind. I kept scrolling, reading message after message, like she didn't even care if I found out. She couldn't even be bothered to hide it. All that time, I'd been convincing myself that she was staying late at work because she was dedicated, committed. But the only thing she was dedicated to was Ethan. Every line, every little hint of romance they shared, felt like a knife twisting deeper into my chest. And the worst part? Seeing how she talked about me to him, like I was nothing more than a burden, something she'd gotten stuck with. She made me out to be a joke, like I was holding her back or trapping her. The woman I thought I'd loved had turned into someone unrecognizable. Someone who clearly despised me enough to parade around with her boss while I sat at home, clueless. I slammed the laptop shut, but I couldn't hold the anger, the betrayal, all of it swirling inside me. That night, I called Daniel, the one person who'd actually listened to me when I'd started having doubts. I told him everything, every sick detail, every humiliating word they'd exchanged. He was quiet for a bit, just letting me get it all out. And finally he said, "Reed, you've got to think about your next move. Just confronting her might not be enough." He suggested I reach out to Ethan's wife, Hannah, to see if she knew anything. I hadn't even thought about her. But as Daniel kept talking, it started to make sense. Maybe I wasn't the only one suffering through this hell. He admitted he'd noticed a few things between Emma and Ethan, but he hadn't wanted to meddle. With my hands still shaking, I found Hannah on social media. I sent her a message, explaining what was going on as carefully as I could. I didn't want to sound like a madman, but I needed answers, and she was the only person who might understand. That night, I barely slept. I tossed and turned, half expecting her to respond with some denial, something that would make me feel like I was crazy. But Hannah wrote back. She was blunt, almost as if she'd been waiting for someone to tell her the truth. We agreed to meet at a nearby cafe, and when I walked in, I spotted her immediately. She looked as exhausted as I felt, like she hadn't slept in days. Our eyes met, and in that moment, we both understood each other's pain without even needing words. I told her everything, about the emails, the messages, every disgusting detail. She barely spoke, just nodded, her face getting paler with every word. Then she opened up. She told me she'd had her suspicions too, about how Ethan had been distant, making excuse after excuse, taking more business trips than usual. She'd sensed something was wrong but hadn't realized how deep it went. Apparently, Ethan had a history. He'd been using people at work to get what he wanted for years. She never thought he'd go as far as getting involved with Emma. But Hannah didn't break down. Her jaw clenched, and I saw a fire in her eyes. She was as determined as I was to take them down. She described Ethan's manipulative tactics, how he'd use his position to get his way and then discard people once he was done with them. Emma was just his latest pawn, and it didn't even seem like she cared. Or maybe she did, and it just didn't matter to her anymore. Either way, they were both deep in this mess. Having someone there who got it, someone just as broken but just as determined to act, gave me the strength I needed. As we talked through every lie, every betrayal, something in me shifted. I wasn't going to be the fool who let this slide, who slunk away with my head hanging. I could see that same determination in Hannah's eyes. We weren't just victims anymore. We had a chance to hit them where it hurt. We sat for hours going over everything, comparing details, laying out a plan. She even mentioned that Ethan had been involved in some shady financial dealings, things he thought he'd kept hidden by fudging company records. Hearing that sparked something in me. If we could bring those skeletons into the light, we could tear down both Ethan and Emma. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about taking back our dignity. By the end of that meeting, we had a rough plan. It was far from complete, but we were both committed. This wouldn't end with some quiet confrontation or a weak apology. If they wanted to mess with our lives, fine. We'd give them a taste of their own game, one they'd never forget. Planning revenge in my head had felt abstract, but sitting down with Hannah and mapping it all out made it feel real. We weren't just hurt, betrayed people anymore. We were becoming something else. Stronger, more resolved, and yeah, maybe a bit ruthless. But after everything they'd done, it felt right. Hannah was the one who planted the seed. She had this fire in her, a resolve I hadn't seen before, and it almost felt like I was trying to keep up. Over cups of coffee, she laid it all out. Ethan had been skimming from the company, manipulating records for his own benefit. She knew enough from overheard conversations and whispers around the office to know we could expose him if we created the right scenario, if we set things up just right. As Hannah and I bounced around ideas, a thought struck me. Daniel knew people at Emma's workplace. He could start spreading whispers about her cozy little relationship with Ethan. If enough people started talking, her pristine, professional image would crumble. Emma had always loved being the one who seemed above it all, polished, untouchable. Just imagining her trying to keep up that front as people's eyes narrowed in suspicion, it was a satisfying thought. To hammer out the specifics, Hannah invited me over for dinner. Walking into another man's home to plot his downfall with his own wife was surreal. Ethan had probably sat at that very table, smug and pleased with himself, maybe even bragging about how clueless I was. The thought kept my focus sharp. Hannah and I sat across from each other, diving into the details, bouncing ideas like we were old partners in crime. She explained the lengths Ethan had gone to with his shady financial tricks, twisting company records to make himself look like some corporate hotshot. If we could stage it right, making it appear like he'd been caught falsifying documents, the company would have no choice but to investigate. And if they dug deep enough, Ethan would be finished. Dinner turned into hours of talk, sharing not just plans but stories from our marriages. The little betrayals, the moments we'd ignored. I told her about Emma, the woman I thought I'd spend my life with, the one I thought I knew. She shared how she'd once believed Ethan was someone worth admiring, back when she'd fallen for him. Hearing her side of things felt strangely familiar, as if we'd both been let down by the same person. We poured another glass of wine, and I couldn't ignore the spark between us. Her hand brushed mine, and suddenly everything we'd been holding in came pouring out. It wasn't just physical attraction. It was the shared understanding of hurt, betrayal, and a craving for something real after living in lies. We didn't speak. We just let it happen, finding comfort in each other, a reprieve from the anger and bitterness, even if just for one night. For once, we weren't just two people who'd been wronged. We were two people finding solace in a way neither of us expected. The next morning, we didn't dwell on it. We both knew what it meant and went back to the plan, keeping our focus on what needed to be done. It was time to bring in more help, and Hannah mentioned an old contact of hers, Simon. He was a financial consultant with a grudge against Ethan, who'd left the company after a fallout over some creative accounting. When we reached out, he didn't need convincing. Simon was on board before we'd even finished explaining. In the days that followed, we gathered everything we needed. With Simon's help, we crafted a bogus partnership deal, something Ethan wouldn't be able to resist. Simon guided us through the setup, making it look like a lucrative opportunity, one that would rope Ethan in only to unravel his finances once he bit. Ethan's arrogance and greed would do half the work for us. By the time he realized he'd been played, it would be too late. Of course, nothing ever goes off without a hitch. Hannah's sister, Charlotte, showed up unexpectedly while we were deep in conversation about Ethan's vulnerabilities. She picked up on what we were planning in seconds. She confronted Hannah, begging her to back off before things spiraled out of control. "This could ruin us all, Hannah. What are you thinking?" she hissed. But Hannah didn't flinch. She laid it all out for Charlotte, the affair, the manipulation. Charlotte looked horrified, but Hannah stood firm, and eventually, her sister left, shaken but silent. Hannah and I knew we needed more ammunition, so she arranged a meeting with Maya, one of Ethan's subordinates, a woman who might know more about his business trips with Emma. Hannah played it off as a casual catch-up for career advice, while I watched from a nearby table out of sight. Maya was surprisingly open, describing Ethan's habit of weekend meetings and after-hours sessions for his favorites. She seemed to know what was really going on, even if she didn't say it outright. Hearing it from Maya was the confirmation we needed. Ethan wasn't just a manipulator on paper. He was using people, manipulating everything and everyone around him for his gain. The plan was really taking shape now. We had Ethan's financial weaknesses thanks to Simon, and Emma's reputation at work was starting to fray. With a few more nudges, they'd be too wrapped up in their own messes to notice us dismantling their carefully constructed lives. But just when we thought we had all the pieces in place, Maya told us something that made our stomachs drop. Ethan was supposedly considering a big promotion for Emma, a position that would put her even closer to him in the company. If she accepted, it would be harder to pull her away from his influence, and she'd have even more leverage to help cover his tracks. That realization lit a fire in us. We weren't just taking down two cheaters. We were breaking up a toxic bond they were both too blind to see was ruining everything around them. As Hannah and I wrapped up that night, the weight of it all hit me. This was bigger than revenge. This was about getting our lives back, putting an end to the lies and manipulation that had poisoned our marriages. We shared a look as we left, a silent promise that no matter what, we'd see this through together. Simon turned out to be the last piece we needed. He was sharp, ruthless, and most importantly, he despised Ethan. After leaving the company, he'd carried that grudge, biding his time for the right moment to strike back. "If you're serious about taking him down, I'm in," he told us. "I've been waiting for someone to finish what he started." We met in a dim, out-of-the-way bar, the kind of place where no one pays attention to hushed conversations. Simon didn't waste time. He laid out how we'd use Ethan's ego and greed against him. We'd set up a fake deal, a supposed partnership that would drain company funds under the guise of an investment. Simon structured it so that it would look like easy money, bait Ethan couldn't resist. By the time he figured out he'd been duped, the damage would be irreversible. While Simon worked on the deal's technical side, Hannah tackled her end of the plan with surgical precision. She tapped into her network, spreading whispers about Emma's relationship with Ethan. Hannah was strategic, never outright accusing, just planting seeds of doubt. Emma had no idea what was coming. Soon, people were whispering, casting judgmental looks, giving her the cold shoulder at work. For a woman who prided herself on professionalism, it was like torture. I could see it in her face when she'd come home, tense and frustrated. First, she brushed it off, claiming work stress. But one night, I made an offhand comment about her close work relationship. She turned pale, then snapped, sneering that I lacked ambition and didn't understand her world. The disdain in her voice hit like a slap. Any trace of guilt I'd felt about our plan vanished. As we kept digging, Hannah and I tracked down Owen, an ex-employee who'd been fired after Ethan used him as a scapegoat. Owen didn't hesitate to tell us where to look, showing us the loopholes Ethan had used and the times he'd dipped into company funds for personal gain. Owen's information was gold. It not only confirmed our suspicions, but it gave us all we needed to file an anonymous complaint. With every piece falling into place, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. We were almost ready to pull the trigger on the plan that would end it all for Ethan and Emma. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like a victim. And this time, they wouldn't see it coming. Hannah and I crafted that report with precision, ensuring it was credible but impossible to trace back to us. We sent it straight to the regulatory authorities, and it wasn't long before the company's accounting department found itself tangled up in an investigation. Meanwhile, Hannah managed to secure access to a few key documents that Simon needed to set up the fake deal. Simon laid out every detail, creating a paper trail that would lead straight back to Ethan, framing him in what would look like an embezzlement scheme. Ethan was about to walk right into the trap, completely unaware until it would be too late. At home, though, things were reaching a boiling point. Emma could feel her career teetering, even if she didn't realize it was all part of our plan. She was constantly on edge, snapping at me for the smallest things. She'd throw out jabs like, "I need someone who can keep up with me," and "I'm done settling." It was like she was trying to convince herself that I was the problem, not her. After one of her tirades, I'd had enough. "Why don't you just be honest with me, Emma?" I asked, barely keeping my voice steady. "Who are you spending all these late nights with? Your boss, Ethan?" Her eyes widened for a moment, but then her face hardened. "Don't you dare accuse me of that," she spat, but her voice lacked conviction. She didn't deny it outright, just tried to twist the blame back onto me, calling me insecure, saying I was holding her back. She claimed she deserved a better life, that I was only dragging her down. Any last doubt I had about the plan dissolved right there. She wasn't the woman I'd fallen in love with. She was someone who'd tossed aside everything we'd built together for a fling and a promotion. If that was who she wanted to be, fine. I'd make sure she faced the consequences. Back at the company, things were unraveling quickly. Hannah's whispers had spread, and Ethan was starting to feel the pressure. The anonymous complaint had triggered an internal investigation, and Ethan's flawless facade was beginning to show cracks. His arrogance blinded him to the fact that the people he'd relied on were now the ones undermining him. The final blow came from Owen. He handed over one last piece of evidence he'd saved from his time at the company. Records showing funds Ethan had used for personal expenses. Company money he'd burned through on private trips and fine dining that had nothing to do with business. Owen had kept it all this time, just waiting for the right moment, and now he passed it to us with a grin. He knew this was the nail in Ethan's coffin. With Simon's expertise and the evidence we'd gathered, the trap was set. The fake deal was ready, the rumors were spreading, and Ethan was walking straight into his own destruction, none the wiser. All we had to do now was sit back and watch it unfold. That evening, as I watched Emma head out for another late-night meeting, I felt an odd satisfaction. She had no idea what was coming, and neither did Ethan. They thought they could have their little affair and their careers without a hitch. But they'd messed with the wrong people, and they'd soon learn betrayal comes with a price. The company's issues started to unravel almost too perfectly. At first, it was just small inconsistencies, little red flags in the financials that made Ethan's partners look a bit closer. But, as Simon had predicted, those small flags quickly turned into a glaring spotlight on Ethan's shifty dealings. Investors began to pull out, board members grew suspicious, and whispers about his special relationships with subordinates were spreading. It was a storm he couldn't manage, and every attempt to reassure his partners only made him look more desperate. Emma, though, was as oblivious as ever. Riding high on her important role, she continued pretending she was a rising star in the company. Watching her waltz around like she was untouchable was infuriating. So, when the chance came to snap her back to reality, I seized it. There was a corporate event coming up, the kind of thing she'd usually insist I skip. But this time I decided to go. If she was so proud of her respectable position, surely she'd be fine with her husband being there. When I walked in, she looked genuinely shaken, giving me a strained smile, acting like everything was fine. But it wasn't. I saw the way people looked at her, the way conversations hushed as she walked by. Hannah's handiwork was working, and the whispers were growing louder. I wasn't about to let the moment slip by. I cleared my throat in the middle of her little circle of colleagues, drawing their attention. Her face fell. She knew what was coming. "Emma," I said, calm and steady. "Since you're so committed to your career, why don't you tell everyone here just how close you've gotten to your boss, Ethan?" The room went dead silent. Her face turned pale, then red, and she tried to laugh it off, claiming I was jealous, that I was being ridiculous. But the damage was done. People started whispering, giving her side glances, and the more she denied it, the guiltier she looked. I let her sink further, watching as she tried to salvage her dignity. "Jealous, Emma?" I said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I'm not jealous. I'm done being humiliated." My words hung heavy in the air, and the shock on her face was almost satisfying. She stammered, but there was no coming back from this. Her reputation was shredded, and she knew it. I left her there, standing alone to face the fallout. Walking out of that room, I felt a strange sense of relief, like a weight I'd been carrying had finally lifted. The truth was out, and there was no taking it back. The next day, Emma tried to salvage her pride by running to her parents, hoping they'd sympathize. Later, I heard she'd given them her own version of the story, painting me as the bitter, insecure husband who couldn't handle her success. But once they got the real story, once they understood the real reason our marriage had shattered, they sided with me. I could imagine her face when her own parents refused to support her. She'd put herself on this pedestal, thinking she was above it all, and now even her own family saw the truth. The call ended in an argument, with her parents telling her they couldn't condone what she'd done. For the first time, Emma was truly on her own. I thought that was it, that I'd feel whole again. But later that evening, Daniel, my friend who'd been by my side through all of this, came over to check in on me. I told him everything that had happened. From the confrontation at the event to Emma's parents turning their backs on her. There was a sense of closure, sure, but an emptiness too. "You know," Daniel said, giving my shoulder a firm squeeze, "this might be the fresh start you need. Maybe it's time to build something of your own, free from all the bitterness Emma left behind." He went on, talking about how he'd even back me, help me get on my feet. "Let's get you started on a clean slate," he added with a grin. It was more than I expected. Daniel believed in me, saw something in me that Emma had only ever tried to snuff out. For the first time in ages, I felt hopeful, like there was a light at the end of this twisted tunnel. It reminded me that there was a life beyond the mess Emma had brought into my world. Meanwhile, Hannah wasn't done. The internal chaos she'd sparked at the company was eating away at Ethan. She knew exactly where to press, quietly undermining his authority and spreading enough whispers to paint him as a reckless leader. And with the rumors of his indiscretions piling up, his once untouchable reputation was cracking wide open. Employees were anxious, partners were wary, and Ethan was running out of allies fast. Hannah's relentless effort, paired with Simon's fake deal and the anonymous complaint, had created the perfect storm. The company was hanging by a thread, and Ethan's name was front and center in every scandal. He was scrambling to hold it all together, but it was clear his empire was crumbling under him. I kept an eye on Emma from a distance in those days. She was a shadow of the woman she tried to portray. Her confidence shattered, her reputation destroyed. It was ironic. She'd spent so much time looking down on me, convinced I was the one holding her back. But now she was the one with nothing. This was the end of the line for Ethan and Emma. And for me, it was the start of something new. Ethan's empire was on the edge, and neither he nor Emma saw it coming. The fake deal Simon had set up did exactly what we'd hoped. It exposed every hidden crack in Ethan's financial foundations. But it didn't stop there. With impeccable timing, Hannah had anonymously provided key documents to external auditors, confirming every one of their suspicions and pushing Ethan further into hot water. The investigation got serious fast. Auditors combed through the company records, uncovering shady transactions and questionable expenses. Ethan's partners, once his staunch supporters, began to turn on him. As evidence piled up, rumors turned to accusations, and accusations turned to ultimatums. They wanted him out. Hannah and I watched it unfold from the sidelines, barely needing to lift a finger. Ethan had done most of the work himself, led by his own arrogance. Every email, every transaction, every lie came back to haunt him. The man who'd thought he was untouchable had become the company's biggest liability, and his partners had no interest in keeping him around. But it wasn't just Ethan's downfall. It was Emma's, too. Her rising star reputation vanished, replaced by whispers and skeptical looks. When the scandal broke publicly, her name was dragged through the mud right along with his. She'd tied her future to him, and now her career was sinking with his. With Ethan's fate sealed, there was only one thing left for me to do. I filed for divorce. The moment I handed her the papers, I saw her mask drop. For the first time in months, she seemed to understand how serious I was. She tried to downplay everything, throwing out excuses, twisting things around like I'd somehow misunderstood it all. "Reed, it wasn't what you think," she pleaded, putting on her best remorseful act. "I was just caught up in something I thought would help my career. I didn't mean to hurt you." I looked her straight in the eye. I wasn't interested in her lies anymore. There would be no reconciliation, no second chance. She wasn't getting a penny from me, and I made it clear I wouldn't be dividing assets. She'd walked into this mess alone, and that's exactly how she'd walk out of it. By the time she realized I meant every word, it was too late. As the divorce proceedings began, the scandal hit the media. Hannah and I made sure every filthy detail, Ethan's affair with Emma, his fraudulent dealings, the entire sordid affair, reached the press. The company's reputation plummeted, and Ethan and Emma were at the heart of it. Business circles are ruthless, and with her name tied to scandal, Emma quickly found out just how little sympathy she'd get. Job offers dried up, and anyone who'd once supported her was suddenly unavailable. Watching her downfall should have felt like victory, but mostly I just felt done. The anger, the resentment, it was all behind me now. I was ready to move on, to focus on building something real. And that's when Lucy came into the picture. She'd been there the whole time, the loyal friend who stood by me, offering a quiet shoulder to lean on without expecting anything in return. With Daniel's investment offer, Lucy and I decided to go into business together. She had a knack for seeing opportunities where others saw dead ends, and together we built something from scratch. It felt like a fresh start, having someone by my side who valued honesty and real partnership, the kind of bond one thought I'd lost. The weeks turned to months, and somewhere along the way things shifted. Lucy wasn't just my business partner anymore. She became the person I looked forward to seeing every day, the one who made me feel like I was building something meaningful. She'd been there for me at my worst, and now she was there as I began to feel alive again. In the end, Emma was left with nothing but the wreckage of her own choices. She was alone, her career and reputation destroyed, and with no one left to fall back on. Ethan was out of the picture, his empire reduced to rubble, and Hannah had washed her hands of him too. She moved on, rebuilding her own life with quiet satisfaction, free from the mess he'd dragged her into. As for me, I'd finally found peace. My life was my own again, free from the lies and the manipulation that had once weighed me down. Starting over wasn't easy, but it was worth every bit of struggle. I'd found a partner who valued me for who I was, who saw promise where others only saw limits. And for the first time in a long time, I was ready to embrace whatever came next. Emma had been right about one thing. I did deserve a better life. And now I was living it one honest day at a time.